Welcome to the Red Gauge Podcast. We are your hosts. I'm Kyle. This is Josh. If you could please like, comment, subscribe, share. It helps out the show a ton. We'd really appreciate it. Today, we are joined by the distinguished Dr. Tim Suchomel. He's a lecturer or professor at the University of Pittsburgh, and he's got a new book coming out, right?
That's right. It's long-term process. Started writing it back in 2023, so here we are.
Yeah. Yeah, every meaningful piece of writing that I've ever tried to work on took a substantial amount more than I'd hoped it would.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you don't really realize, I've written book chapters before, but until you have to put multiple chapters together for like a singular concept, it's certainly challenging, but at the same time, you can have a lot of fun with it too. The other aspect is, how many times do you have to reread everything? How many times do you have to look at the art to see that it's the way that you want it? I'm still going through the process. It's supposed to come out in June, July, like late June, early July. But yeah, it's a process, no doubt about that.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've been working in strength research for a long time. Like I think I've been seeing your name on papers for 10, 11 years now. Does that sound about right? Yeah.
Yeah. I'd say, it really started to ramp up when I got to my PhD. I was finishing up my master's thesis, and my master's thesis kind of served as the foundation of a lot of the research that we've been doing on weightlifting movements and their derivatives. But all things strength power are things that I'm interested in. So we're doing a lot of eccentric training research right now. I know you had just talked to Chris Tabor not too long ago, and he and I are collaborating on a number of projects related to eccentric training. But we're in the process of publishing that. The book coming out. We have athlete monitoring research, but different aspects of developing the athlete in terms of strength and power. Considering that's our foundation, I think it's a good place to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question. So I think everybody, I'm trying to think of people that might not be in the world of strength coaching or lifting. I think everybody would understand strength. But can you give like a little bit when you say power? What do you mean? Because like my kids might be like, "Oh, this guy's a powerlifting coach." I was like, that's not what he's talking about.
Yeah, the joke is not the joke, but you almost think the sports of weightlifting and powerlifting have their names reversed. Because there's a ton of power in the sport of weightlifting. There's not a lot of power in powerlifting.
Yeah.
Primarily because the weights are so heavy and they're not moving crazy fast versus you have a, fairly significant weight. When you get Lasha Talakhatsi, who's snatching 225 kilos and, clean and jerking 270 kilos, but moving it fast enough to actually get under it, that's a different story. I mean, that's borderline inhuman. I'm not going to say that it's drug induced, but some of that sport, I love the sport. You just never know sometimes. But so I will say, to answer your question, so strength to me is beyond how much weight someone could lift. It is an ability to produce force within a task specific context. So powerlifting has a specific aspect of strength. You have peak maximal force production during a squat, a deadlift, a bench press, and those are your lifts. You could say the exact same thing about expressing force or expressing strength during a clean, during a snatch, etc. And power is a byproduct of how you actually produce that force within a shorter period of time. So power, it's kind of been described to me more recently as kind of a fluffy metric.
Uh-huh.
It's something that's great. It's sexy. It's great to look at, and it relates to sport performance and everything. Because if I take the 100-meter dash, for example, there's a certain amount of work that has to be done in a straight line, and the person who completes that work in the shortest amount of time wins. 100-meter dash, you could argue that not only are they the fastest being in the world, they are also the most powerful being in the world within that context. So, power can also be, it's kind of funny, and maybe Chris had talked about this as well. We always got the emphasis on either force or velocity, because power is the product of force and velocity. So Dr. Stone would always tell us you have force times velocity, and then you have force times velocity, really to emphasize one or the other. But at the same time, power is a product of a combination of force and velocity, and the task, the load, etc., is going to dictate how much power can actually be produced.
Yeah. Yeah, when talking to kids, I'd always kind of distinguished it like as more of like a spectrum where like strength is on the one end, like you were saying, work at a task, right? And then, or force at a task, and then speed is at the other, which is like unladen, and like anywhere in between where the velocity matters, but you have something that you've got to push on, then you're in the realm of power work. But that's really broad, right? So like it's very different for a weightlifter versus a shot putter versus a wrestler, right? Because the implement that you're pushing against is very different.
Absolutely, I 100% agree. I think we always get these images, and I've put some of these images out too within presentations and things like that, where you have the force velocity curve and you put different tasks and everything along it. And it's not that it's wrong. It's more of a visualization concept emphasizing either force or velocity within that specific task. But the reality is, there may not be, there's a lot of velocity in sprinting, and it's going to be pictured in that high velocity side of the force velocity curve, but there's a lot of force too, and it's done over a really short period of time. So, we mentioned the book previously, and I know one of the things that I did within one of the chapters was put together a figure that shows not only the force production of different tasks, but it's also the timing of how long those tasks actually take. So if you take elite sprinters, for example, they're only on the ground 90 milliseconds,
right.
And they're producing 5 times body weight on a single limb. I mean, if that's not power, I don't know what is.
Yeah. Impressive power.
Right.
Yeah.
So how important is it then for training? Like how important is it to be close to the power that you're trying to put out in your sport? Like if you are a sprinter, do you want to try to stay within that 90 milliseconds, or do you want to stay within that 5 times body weight, or do you want to, like how does a trainee dial in their power work? Because track was my thing, and I was a thrower, and you can spend a lot of time doing things that look like power work, but they're a third the speed of your actual event. And then when you spend a little more time doing things that are closer to the speed of your event, all of a sudden you start noticing like, oh, this feels a lot crispier. There's a lot more, there's a lot sharper. So what's the kind of like recommendations for people on that?
Yeah. So I hate to give you the science answer of it depends, but it kind of does. The reality is, short to long development when it comes to sprinting is really important. In terms of the distances that they're covering, because there's certain pieces of a sprint that are really important. You obviously have an acceleration or drive phase. You have the transition to upright running. You have max velocity work. So every single piece of that requires its own emphasis, but it's building on one aspect to another. So it's vertical integration in the sense that I'm never going to take acceleration work out, but I'm going to, decrease the amount of it that I'm doing during certain phases. I'm going to increase the amount of it that I'm doing in other phases. So if my goal, if I'm in the off season, I don't have to be at peak performance now. What I need to do is develop the underlying, mechanisms that will allow me to be fast and explosive later. It's kind of like you can relate it back to, resistance training work. If your ultimate goal is power output, we know that pieces of muscle architecture in terms of hypertrophy and strength and rate of force development are going to benefit power in the long run. But from a sprinting standpoint, you want to spend the necessary time developing the acceleration phase in terms of producing a lot of force both vertically and horizontally to get out of the blocks effectively, and then spend the necessary time in a subsequent phase building on that to be able to move from kind of that angled, the drive phase in our acceleration to become more upright as someone begins to run. So when I'm describing this to my grad students, I was like, I want you to think about a plane. A plane, when it takes off, has to push very much horizontally. Now, granted, plane may be a bad example because if you only push horizontally when you sprint, you're going to end up on your face. But the idea is that you can see that as in order to take off, you have to start to produce more vertical force, against the ground, against the earth. Now, planes aside, the amount of force that we put into the ground, both vertically and horizontally, is going to vary based on the phase. So if I'm going to train an athlete to work on an acceleration phase, I'm going to use, basic hill accelerations. I'm going to use sled work. I'm going to use towing, because it's in the position that they need to be in to produce a lot of force, but also to mimic the positions that they're going to be in. And then as we transition, you have to expose them to some upright running, but you also have to maintain what you built in the previous phase. So this may be a very long-winded answer to your question, but the idea is that going from short to long is going to give you better benefits than only focusing on just one phase all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. So when we're focusing on those phases, like if we're, we've got the drive phase dialed up or we've got the upright phase dialed up, when you're looking for support exercises, so a lot of the ones you mentioned are really similar in terms of where they're at on that force velocity curve, right? Like if you're dragging a sled or running a hill or whatever, you're only going to be, a hill might be 10% off or 20% off or whatever of your actual movement speed. Is that kind of a target that you would look for when you're trying to develop power in each one of those phases, that you want to be pretty close to the movement that you want to be doing?
Yeah, it varies as well because, again, are we off season? Are we pre-season? Like where are we in terms of that? And admittedly, I'm probably not the guru that you would want to talk to about sprinting. There's a lot of people.
You can just switch it from sprinting to anything.
Yeah, just power in general.
Yeah.
Like whatever the power work is that you're trying to do.
Podcast.
Yeah. I mean, I would never. I always try to pair a lot of these phases. Like if I'm working with a sprinter, I'm going to focus on the positions that they're going to be, that I want them to hit. I want them to spend during an acceleration phase. They're going to be producing a larger amount of force, a lower amount of force over a longer period of time on the ground. So at that point, I'm going to pair my phases of resistance training with that. At that point, you may actually be doing higher volume work in the weight room. Why? Because you're not focused on developing peak rate of force development yet. You're laying the foundation, you're developing work capacity. I mean, you mentioned that you work with weight class sports primarily. The weightlifting movements can be paired with every single one of these phases that we've been talking about. So doing things out of the blocks for sprinting can be paired with doing clean pulls from the floor, because you're actually going to hit a lot of the same angles that you would hit during a sprint acceleration anyway. So it just becomes very specific, and the concept of dynamic correspondence starts to apply pretty significantly.
Yeah. So I was hoping to get kind of a preview of what was going to be in the book, because the things that I've heard from people sounds like it's pretty exciting. It's exciting for me. My first real training book that I read, I think, was Super Training, and I didn't actually read the whole thing. I don't know if anybody reads Super Training front to back. It's pretty intense, but it's a cool resource.
It's dense. It's dense to say the least. Yeah.
Yeah. But basically every book that I've written or I've read, not written, every book that I've read since then has been, like a really great experience when it's a strength science kind of book. I like, was it Schoenfeld did the hypertrophy book a few years ago? That one was really good. So, could you tell us a little bit about what's going to be in your book?
Can we start
Yeah,
with a
so
title? Do you have a title?
Oh yeah,
I
title.
do. I do.
Dr. Tim dominates.
Yeah.
Tim's book.
Well, it's kind of funny because I'm not going to say that they're in a series because they are their own. They are their own books, but it's published by the same company. So Brad Schoenfeld's book was Science and Development of Muscle Hypertrophy. My book is called Science and Development of Muscular Strength. So it focuses on the concept of strength, but in a broad spectrum. So the very first chapter is called Defining Strength, and the fun part of that chapter is I was actually going through older writings and things like that to kind of outline the history of different strength competitions. So it goes through like ding lifting back in ancient China. It goes through the manhood stones. In ancient Greece, but also in Scotland, things like that. But ultimately, the chapter comes back to this concept of what is strength, and kind of as we were talking, during the show, is that strength is a fluid concept. It's an ability to produce force. It's not solely based on how much weight you can lift, but it's how someone is able to express force production within a certain task. So the ultimate definition that we came up with in the book was the ability to produce force against an external resistance within a task-specific concept or context. And the idea, the external resistance can be your body weight. It can be your body weight plus somebody else's. It can be an implement that you are trying to hit or kick or something like that. But it has to be also task specific because there's a learning component to be able to express force effectively. So, we go through all the different definitions of what is strength endurance, strength power, what is strength speed, speed strength, maximal strength, relative strength. So that's just chapter one. But the idea is that the ability to produce force, I actually highlight the who I consider kind of the first strength coach, and that's Isaac Newton. I like to think that Isaac Newton, under his robe and everything, you see pictures and he was just jacked, but he also used to have like a handlebar mustache and everything. But at least I depicted that in one of the presentations I've done before.
That makes sense.
Yeah, exactly.
Got a thumbnail for the episode.
Yeah.
Jacked
So,
Isaac Newton.
So the idea is that Newton's three laws certainly lay the foundation for what force production and strength actually are. But in addition to that, the impulse momentum theory comes down to, if I'm producing a lot of force and I'm producing it against, over a certain period of time, I'm going to be able to create a certain momentum of the task. So it becomes like if I'm I'm not a rugby player, but if I was a rugby player, I would want to be big and I'd want to be fast and explosive because momentum in that sport kills. If you've ever watched the Six Nations rugby or any of the Rugby World Cup and everything, you got some big hosses running through there. And I look at some of those like, yeah, I don't want to be hit by that. I'm good. I'm good.
Not even a little bit.
No, not even a little bit. But some of the other things that we get into with the book is we talk about the strength related responses and adaptations to training, different methods of training, the timeline of adaptation, but also kind of the detraining concept, external stressors. But another chapter is on the mechanisms of strength. So this chapter we get into specifically with genetics, epigenetics, neuromuscular factors, muscle architecture, neuroendocrine factors, but also the motor learning side of things in terms of individual tasks. Like how can I develop force more effectively by becoming more coordinated in the actual movement itself. Because the reality is, when we learn a new task, like the example that I always use is, do you remember the first time you ever shot a free throw?
Yeah, I do.
Probably.
So-
Yes. Me, no.
So, do you remember, like, when you were a kid and you shoot a free throw for the first time, did you bring the ball straight up, or did you bring it off to the
No.
side and kind
Yeah.
of twist with it?
It was from the hip, and I didn't quite make it to the rim.
Right.
Yeah.
So, but the idea behind it is we don't have the necessary force production or coordination behind the task to produce force effectively. It's the same exact thing if I were to ask you, do you remember the first time you squatted? Because the first time you bring that bar on your back and you go down, you're like shaking back and forth because you're like, I don't know what needs to turn on and turn off, and what movement am I actually doing? Am I pushing my hips too far back? But it's a coordination piece of it. But as we become more coordinated within the actual task, we produce force more effectively, and then we add additional constraints to it. So now I want you to descend slowly. I want you to descend faster. I want you to move as quickly as possible on the way up. Now we're going to add chains or bands to it. Now I'm going to add weight releasers to it. So every single time we modify the task, it becomes a new motor program, for lack of a better term, that we are trying to use and develop. So that's a massive aspect of being able to not only produce force, but produce it effectively so that it then transfers to our sporting tasks that have similar movement patterns.
Okay.
Can I jump in there?
Yeah.
So, as a strength coach, I'm just thinking, so if you're kind of changing, let's just say with squats, and we're doing squats and front squats and chained squats and banded squats, maybe they're reverse banded squats, whatever. If I'm changing that too often, can I be running into maybe I'm just going through the cycle of the kids are just trying to become more coordinated and they never quite get coordinated in the movement, and then I'm moving on? Like, is too much differentiation going to hold a strength coach back because they just never good at the movement before they move on? I know there's lots of people that they just lift one way, and then there's lots, at least on the internet right now, that's like they're just moving through all sorts of different types of movements. Like, could that hold you back?
You hit the nail on the head. Too much variation and not allowing an individual to take the time to develop the necessary motor program is a negative for sure. You want to be able to solidify the technique with the basics. I've always said, do the basics and annoyingly well or insanely well before you start to add additional variation to it. Which is why we always mention. Sorry, the cat feeder's going off right now. Do you hear that? But you'll appreciate the fact that one of the cat's names is Kilo.
Nice.
But yeah, you want to be able to introduce different task constraints to the individual as they continue to get better with the technique. But I'm also of the opinion that adding too much variation too early doesn't allow them to develop the necessary motor program to move effectively. And it's kind of like, if you've ever seen someone have you two either used weight releasers before?
Oh yeah.
So the very first time you had weight releasers on,
Mm-hmm.
I'm guessing they were probably either empty or had just like a small amount of weight on it, right? Or
No.
maybe not.
No, the first time
Kyle's a strange character.
the first time I used weight releasers, I was doing bench press with my brother and his bodybuilder friends, and they had me doing, I want to say, like 45 pounds a side of extra weight, and so it was one where like just unracking it was hard. And then as I started coming down, I very quickly began to fear for my life.
Yep.
And, when they kick off at the bottom, it's a very, relief, I don't think I even completed the lift, even though it was very submaximal because I was so freaked out about getting choked to death.
It is a different bear, no doubt about that. Because, whether you're squatting, benching, whatever, the stability component of it, you feel the small swing of the weight releasers. And generally speaking, you're either not going to stand there or you're not going to hold that bar up there until they completely stop. It's challenging because you're just holding it there otherwise. But at the same exact time, when we familiarize people within our research, and I'm sure it's the same with Chris's research, we have to take them through a series of different movements in order for them to feel comfortable with the actual weight on there. So, like, before I have someone descend with, do a squat with their max or super maximal load, we have them do a walkout with it, because it's like, I want you to feel what that weight is going to feel like when you step back. Because if you have, I'm making this up, but if you have 50% of your max on the bar, but 60% distributed between the actual weight releaser, so there's 110% total, but more than half of that weight is going to fall off, like, you're not, like, mentally, it's hard to, like, make that make sense. You're going to go down, it's really heavy, you kind of have that oh shit moment, right? You get down to the bottom, and then you just stand up really quick. You're like, what just happened?
Yeah.
But at the same time, the very first time you get introduced to it, like, you're leaning forward, you're leaning backward, because you just don't know what the weight's going to do to you until it falls off. Now, the other side of that is you hear it. So you hear the weight releasers hit, but if that bar is not level, only one of the weight releasers is going to fall off. And I had that happen to me when I was doing some pilot testing. And one of the weight releasers fell off, and it started to push out of a squat. And for whatever reason, my mentality was, I'm going to throw the bar over my head. And I did, but I reflected on it afterwards. I was like, that was really stupid, like, really stupid. But yeah, again, getting back to, the variability concept, it's like, if I don't have solid squat technique, bench press technique, the person has no business using, chains, bands, weight releasers, because you're adding variability to something that doesn't need more variability at the time.
Yeah. I know I talked to a really good thrower who was doing like conjugate style training for his weight room stuff. And he was saying that there was a tremendous amount of variety in the exercises that either he had picked for himself or his coach had gotten him. I don't remember which one it was, but he felt when he was doing it like it was the coolest thing ever, because every single week, whatever exercises he was doing were going up by 20 or 30 pounds. Like, very talented strength guy to start with, right? But then also doing novel exercises. So he does an exercise maybe 3 or 4 times in a row and then does a new exercise. And so every time it was going up 20 pounds and going up 20 pounds and going up 20 pounds. And he was like, this is the best thing ever. And then at the end of like a whole like 6-month kind of block of training, he went back and did like the first thing, which was just like a basic squat. And his squat hadn't changed at all. And so it just the accommodating to the exercises felt like progress,
Right.
but it wasn't really like he wasn't spending enough time with any of them to really drive change. Do you have oh, go ahead.
No, all I was going to say is I fully get that. I found out I tend to do a lot of pilot testing on myself before I do any research on certain things. So
Smart.
I'm often my own guinea pig. I found out what not to do with chains. I definitely overtrained myself. I remember doing, pretty heavy squats with chains during a cluster block that was higher volume. And I remember I was like, okay, I'm going to come into this next block. I'm going to use weight releasers. Like, it's going to be really heavy. It's going to be great. I stepped under the bar, would have been the equivalent of like 155 pounds or 70 kilos. I was like, why does this feel so heavy? And at the same exact time, like you mentioned, when you continue to add weight with certain things, but it doesn't always come back to what the other exercise is going to be, you're kind of like, what happened?
Mm-hmm.
This should transfer, but why didn't it? But again, that comes back to the concept of just being consistent with your training. And again, a lot of really good training programs, I hate to say it, are kind of boring.
Yeah.
Right.
It is what it is, but you can't develop maximal strength or improve your maximal strength with a lift unless it is consistent. That's the reality.
Yeah, I mean, we have that conversation with kids all the time. I'm like, you want to do some kind of carry, some kind of hinge, some kind of squat, some kind of overhead press, some kind of straight press, some kind of row, some kind of pull down, right? Seven, it's basically seven things that dress up your entire, and there's obviously going to be lots of finesse in there and there's extra little bits that you want to add or take away. But that's like, the bread and butter of what we're doing. And so
Mhm.
you can't get too far away from it and still have something that's, going to be really effective. Like you might find something that's effective, but not like, what you were hoping for.
Yeah, absolutely. So what, other things we had in the book, like you mentioned that there's different exercises and everything. We have an entire chapter that's dedicated just to training methods
Yeah.
for developing strength, and it has everything from calisthenics to machines to plyos to weightlifting movements, bilateral, unilateral, kettlebells, eccentric training, potentiation complexes. You have blood flow resistance, but it also comes down to, or blood flow restriction rather. But it also comes back to using sprinting as a training method, using change of direction as a training method. And then we expand on some of those in another chapter that's focused on just advanced training methods, which would be potentiation complexes, variable resistance training with chains and bands, and then accentuated eccentric loading with things like weight releasers. So we round that into different program design concepts. We touch on in another chapter concurrent training, so adding the different conditioning methods to it.
I got a question.
Yeah,
Got a question
absolutely.
before we get too far. Because
I don't think I've ever heard Kyle interrupt.
sorry, but there's too much good stuff. I got to get the question in before we get too far. Because my question was actually from chapter 1, and we're in like 4 now. Okay, so
We're moving.
yeah. I'm just gonna start throwing out a flare every once in a while, like
Do it. Do it.
Okay, so in chapter 1, you mentioned that you went and spent some time doing the research on the culture of strength, right? From ancient China to today. That's one of my favorite subjects because I am just constantly like fascinated and sometimes annoyed by the way that it's affected training in the United States. Because our strength culture was basically like strongman, and then it kind of just split into strongman, weightlifting, odd lifts, which became powerlifting, right, and bodybuilding, right, and then people kind
Don't
of
forget
realized,
those Highland games.
oh yeah, they've been in there for a long time.
That's right.
But that kind of has been a thing where people realized at some point, I think I would wager one of your most cited papers that strength is better to be stronger for your sport. Um, like people realize like, oh, the people who are stronger are doing better. The people who are adopting weightlifting are doing better. And so, they go looking for what tools can they pull out and use for their sport, right? When you were doing that, was there anything that you thought was especially fun or especially interesting, like that's worth a share about like the history of strength culture that was like your favorite thing when you found it?
There's certain things that you kind of hear about, but you don't actually fully grasp it until like just for example, there were depictions of snatching in ancient Egypt.
Yeah.
Like they were you doing that in ancient Egypt. It's not a new concept. Like this has been around for a long time. Now obviously, like it used to be like a one arm snatch. So I'm gonna take like a bale or something like that. I'm gonna bring it up. I'm gonna catch it, overhead with one arm. But that eventually, laid the foundation for what we know today in the sport of weightlifting for the snatch. The concept of ding lifting. Ding lifting, it's essentially just a heavy pot, but individuals who would be considered worthy of being soldiers in dynasty China, you have to be able to lift X amount of, however heavy the dings were, and they would have ding lifting champions and those types of things. But obviously, some of the things that are still around, like they have certain stones in Greece that have labels on them saying like this was lifted by so and so, and they tell you the approximate weight of it, and I'm like, they lifted that over their head. What are we doing? Like what
Right.
like where did the evolutionary chain like not work. So, but yeah, the concept of, who's stronger and who's the alpha has been around forever.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah, I
at
was going to
least
say the
from,
second there was a guy that liked a girl, I guarantee you went, maybe she'll like this.
If I pick up something heavy.
yeah,
See
yeah, you
that
never
girl?
know. I
Lifted
mean,
that ding, baby.
it goes back to, Milo and lifting the calf. It, there's all these different stories of these, these historical individuals that I find really fascinating because you just don't hear about it all the time. But the other thing is that if you introduce these concepts to individuals, whether it's grad students now or just younger students, they may have no clue.
Mhm.
They may not have been introduced to this. So for me, being able to write this aspect of the chapter was really important because it's always important to acknowledge kind of where we came from, in order to figure out where we can go,
Yeah.
or where we even are right now. Because there's a lot of different aspects, with different streaming services and all that. There's like you can access all these things, but at the same exact time, there's so many different competitions to keep track of. There's some sports that some people have never even heard about. You
Mhm.
know, like I don't know if you've heard of the sport of shin kicking. This is real.
No.
This is real. And I want to say, I could be wrong, but I want to say it came from Wales. But basically, you have two individuals that wear really high, thick socks and you stuff hay in them. And then you hold on to each other's shoulders and you kick each other's shins until someone falls. I mean,
You just get out
like
there and try to break a dude's leg.
pretty much, yeah. But again, it comes back to who's the alpha. And, we spent some time in Switzerland in October, and they have Schwinge, which is the Swiss wrestling competition. And the individual who ends up winning that competition, we met one of them. He said originally you got like when the sport was invented, the winner got a steer or a cow as like the champion or a bull or something like that. But now it comes, not everyone's a farmer, so you could get that or you could get money. But the best part of all of it is you are known as king for the rest of your life.
That's pretty
And
fun.
yeah, so there's certain rules, there's certain attire and everything like that, but it's, learning about the individual sports to me is really interesting.
I would have taken the bowl, even though I had nowhere to put
Small
it.
apartment.
Just yeah, I just brought it back to the apartment. Be like, I'm the king. You can't take away my bowl. I'm keeping it. It's gonna graze in the wherever, the median of the street,
It
wherever it
kind of
wants
goes
to.
it kind of goes back to that classic interview question. Someone gives you an elephant. You can't kill it and you can't give it away. What do you do? You know?
Yeah,
But yeah, I think the whole concept of the rules, but also the some of the sports that may not be as mainstream, I think are always interesting.
yeah. I know. So the stone, you said the stone lifted by. I want to say the guy's name starts with a B, but I can't remember. Son of something else. That one I think was like 320 or 370 pounds. Did you find any like? Did they have any semi-accurate description of how much the ding lifting was?
I didn't see. I might have had something in there. To be honest, a lot of that blends together. But I know
Yeah,
that I have specific weights for like the Dinny stones. In
Right.
order
yeah.
to to cross the bridge and everything. There's a whole website and everything. Is like the right stone weighs this and the left stone weighs this, and so there are some that are very specific, and then there's other ones that, as you can imagine, I'm sure they've been maybe fluctuated over the years. You
Sure.
just
Yeah,
never
Yeah.
know. But yeah, there's some of those historical stones that still exist, which is really amazing.
yeah, yeah. It'd be fun. That's kind of something. If I ever had the cash, I'd like to go do the world tour and just go pick up heavy stuff.
Yeah,
Iceland, Scotland, Spain has a whole stone lifting
Yeah.
division.
History. Brian Shaw and Eddie Hall and those guys did a little
That was a
Well, sure
great
they do that.
series. That was a great
Yeah.
Yeah, a
series.
little show on all these
Yeah.
cool things.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. That'd be a ton of fun.
I'd love to watch you. I'm sure I can't do a single one. So just
You-
travel around touching things. Like, oh, it seems heavy.
Seems heavy. Okay. In chapter 2, you talked about individual differences, like the, genetic, epigenetic, morphology, that kind of stuff, right?
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Like, were there like surprising takeaways or interesting things that you learned about that you think are worth a shout?
Well, I mean, you can't there's no substitute for good genetics. That's the reality. So we kind of touch on the concept of nature versus nurture. Nature being the genetic side of things, and nurture being the epigenetic side of things. Where the training that someone goes through, they may respond a certain way based on genetic dispositions and everything that they have. But the reality is, a lot of individuals may have submitted, or more recently submitted to genetic type testing, so they can figure out, what could I theoretically be good at.
Yeah.
I know that some countries have taken it to certain extents in terms of, measuring certain sizes of body parts and things like that to try to get that down to a science, and maybe they have something there. I actually just sat on a recent presentation by Andy Galpin at NSCA Coaches Conference, and he basically said, "We don't know. We don't know." Like, like there's so many different polymorphisms and everything to different genetic characteristics that, there's error in these measurements and this, and then it just becomes exponentially more challenging to actually identify something that's going to be identifiable as an individual trait that this person is going to automatically be good at this. Here's the reality also. You may have the best genetics in the world, but maybe you hate the sport.
Right.
I mean that's just it. I mean,
I've met that guy.
Oh yeah. I mean there you could have you get individuals who are really, really tall. And I'm sure tall people, I'm not a tall person, so I can't fathom this, but I'm sure tall individuals get asked the question, like, do you play basketball? Do you play volleyball? And they're like, no, I hate that sport. They some of them may be like, yeah, I've played a long time and everything, but they may be good from a height standpoint, but I've also seen, especially in high school, you see those really tall individuals. It's like a baby deer out there.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen that just being high school coaches for a while. Is every once in a while you'll have a kid who, like, if they had hit that growth spurt 2 years earlier, they'd be a Division I all-star prospect. But instead, they're going like WAIA or some small school or something because they weren't going to fill out till they were 20.
Right.
And so they just missed the calendar.
Oh yeah, I mean, my favorite is I used to umpire Little League Baseball, and the final tournament of the year would be held in August. So the rule was at the beginning of the season you had to be 12, but by the end of the season, as you can imagine, you get some of those kids who had already turned 13, and I'll tell you, some of them, they were shaving. There's no question about that. It goes back to like bench warmers and like I am 12. But I mean, reality, it's like I'm behind home plate and these kids are throwing gas from 45 feet away. And I'm like, yeah, that they're not going to touch that. My favorite is when you always have that really good pitcher on one side and you have a really bad team who's hitting. The catcher just sits on the outside corner and the guy just paints it every single time, just fastball, 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 fastball. And even if they touch it, it just goes off the end of the bat and there's just this little nubber, like out into the field. And it's like,
or into the stands or whatever.
Yeah. Maybe take out the first base coach if they actually get something on it. But, the maturity level and, the exposure to certain things at certain ages is certainly going to play a role in the coordination piece of it, the learning of the skill. But if you take the sport of weightlifting, for example, you'll have some Chinese athletes, and you see videos and camps of these things where kids are 5, like they're, and they're doing, even if it's just with a PVC pipe or a wooden dowel, their technique is better than mine will ever be. And, because they start so early, they then get in that system and then they just go through, and there's so many individuals that go through that sport there. I think the US from a weightlifting standpoint has gotten better, but there are, like you have people like Olivia Reeves and you have Hampton Morris who medaled at the Olympics. And, Olivia was a gold medalist. She is freakishly strong. I just saw her do a squat she weighs about 71 kilos and she just squatted 220. I mean, triple body weight. It's like,
Yeah.
okay, here you go. But at the same exact time, I was like, I'm never going to do that. Not now. You have individuals that if they get on a really good training program really early and they're exposed to the certain movement patterns and everything, they can pick it up really quickly. And you start to see those exponential improvements over the course of the sport, the different tasks and everything, which has kind of gone into, and I know we're going down a rabbit hole here, but
That's why we're here.
yeah, the long-term athlete development piece of it and the one sport athletes, you see it all the time now, where it's like if you want to be good at basketball, you have to play, in this AAU tournament, you have to play this weekend on this travel team within this region against these opponents, and if you play another sport, then you won't be successful. We know that's not true, but at the same exact time, the biggest thing that I worry about is, does the athlete even want to do that? One of the things that I think they have done this in the past is they used to highlight every single Super Bowl how many athletes or how many football players were multi-sport athletes in high school. I loved that. And a lot of them were actually multi-sport athletes in college because in the off season they would run track or throw or something like that would still contribute to a unique aspect of their strength and their power. So, again, we're way away from that question that you asked initially, but all of these factors is why we're in it. I love discussing these types of things.
Yeah, talking about it being like the individual differences being so multifaceted. Like I remember a few years ago reading, kind of like a summary of like the kind of sport genes that they found. And I don't know how many they're up to now, but at the time there was like 28 or something that were like, power genes or endurance genes or, whatever, right? And, when you compare that with like, how are they actually put together, right? Like how limby are they and what do their sockets look like and how big are they and where do their muscles attach and how much fast twitch they got and how much slow twitch they got. Like you really do create a myriad that's like so so-complicated that like trying to pick somebody out of a group is, probably impossible. It's also a big part of the reason why you see like in the US men's shot put right now, there's Ryan Krauser who's 6'7" and 340 pounds and Joe Kovacs who's 5'11" and probably 340 pounds or something. He's pretty massive, but like very different morphologies, right? Like if you were a coach and you saw those two bodies walk on freshman year, you might not know what to do with either one of them, and they ended up being the best shot putters ever.
Yeah. And the reality is there's some things that you just can't teach. You can't teach height.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You also can't coach desire because, it's like if they want to do it, they're going to do it. You can motivate them the as much as you want to, but the reality is, unless they actually want to put the effort in, who knows? That's why I love working with a lot of female athletes as well, because I'm not going to say they don't have the ego that men do, but at the same exact time, it's like I'm 5'6.5". I weigh, like a $150, $155. But it's like if you put me in front of Division I football players, I may be a small guy, but I would also make the argument that when it comes to certain concepts, when it comes to strength training, I probably know about them more than what they do. But at the same exact time, if they want to learn from me, they would.
Yeah.
If they want to get better at certain they're going to put the time in, they're going to invest it. I think the ego thing aside, you can't always, you can't coach that. If someone wants to do it, they're going to do it.
Yeah, I've always found I have boys and girls power teams, and I've always found it way easier to make adjustments for the young ladies
Mm-hmm.
than it is for the men. Because a lot of times when you're making an adjustment or you find something like we got to go back down. Like, all right, okay, over the next couple of weeks you're going to be taking weights that are a little bit lower. Guys don't really want to do that. They don't want to go, so they just try to make the adjustment at the same weight. It just never gets adjusted. Where the girls are like, let's do it. Boom, they're fixed. Rock stars.
Yeah, I remember a point. So I mentioned track was my sport. I got hurt real bad. That ended my sport career. I still love training, so I've still been training, but I took a couple years off when I was like having kids and trying to make jobs work and stuff like that. And then when I went back to training again, I was like, I'm going to follow my own advice. I'm going to do smart stuff. I went in the weight room to see like how strong am I still? And of course I'd been overeating for the entire 5 years that I wasn't lifting weights. And so I was still pretty strong, And then I videotaped it because I was like, I'm going to have good quality movement. It's not going to be a problem. Man, I mean, like my first day back, I think I could still deadlift like 500, but like when I wanted to have a good looking deadlift, it was like $135. Like to have, like everything lined up right and stacked and do what I would coach somebody else to. So I remember wanting to like come in with like my hood up, drawn over my face, maybe a mask, something, but that was a real difficult time emotionally.
I will never forget. I went into the weight room at my last job, and it was the athlete weight room. I was just getting some squats in or whatever, and one of the football players comes in and he starts warming up. The standard 135, 185, 225, 275, 315. So I'm watching in between my sets, and the squats get higher and higher and higher. And the funny thing was the working weight that I had was comparable to what they were doing. And what I really wanted to do, I didn't do this. I was obviously faculty and I didn't want to, to cause any issues. But what I really wanted to do was walk over, squat, like step into their rack, squat the weight full depth, rack it, and then turn around and just say, that's how you squat. Every single time. Don't change anything. But obviously that would have caused more problems than anything else. Anytime I go back to my home gym, I have to kind of put blinders on because I don't want to see some of the things that are happening. Now, granted, the last time I was there, I was actually impressed in terms of the quality of movement. But, I think, we kind of go back to the concept we were talking about earlier, is just doing the basics insanely well. We talk about, technique has to come first. Well, it's like, then preach that. If the technique is good, the weight is going to come. And that was one thing that I emphasized. I worked with the volleyball team at Carroll for years, probably 6 years. I worked with some of them, and I had some of the girls for 4 straight years. And it was like every single year we're adding, and I'm not kidding you, we're adding 30 pounds to a lift. Each time we revisit a phase, and I'm like, this is incredible in terms of how much weight that some of these girls are lifting. I think I had one point, these are D3 athletes. I had one point, I think I had 8 girls squatting over 200 pounds. Volleyball players. So these are generally not shorter individuals. Granted, some of them were shorter. We were D3s. We weren't going to have the 6'4" that some of the D1s have, but it was amazing to see the progress that they would go through. And shout out to the girls, because they probably thought at one point the only thing I knew how to say was put more weight on the bar.
A little harder, please.
Well, no, I mean, but the reality is, a lot of them just didn't know what they were capable of, and so
Yeah.
to your point in working with the women, I think they were more thankful than anything else just to have the attention, to have someone there to say, try this. You're capable of doing this. I promise. You know, it's like I had a one athlete in particular that we did max out testing at the end of one season. It was in the spring semester, and she failed doing a squat at 225. And I said, all right, they came in during the fall. I said, what is your goal? Like, what is your lifting goal? What's your team goal, et cetera, et cetera. And she said, I want to rep 225. All right, I was like, okay, during the season, that's not going to be priority, but when we get to the off season, like, we'll focus on getting you stronger. But when she came back, I said, here's the deal. You can't ask me what's on the bar. Now, I bring that up because where we were lifting was all in kilos,
Oh, nice.
which is great because they may
Which is
not,
great.
if they take the necessary time to do the calculations, they can figure out what it is. But I said, CJ, you cannot ask me what's on the bar. I'm going to tell you what to put on the bar, but don't ask me what's on the bar. And the entire semester we did that. And then at the end of the semester, we get through and she ends up squatting 110 kilos, which is like 245.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, CJ, come over here. I typed in everything on my phone just for the calculation. I said, this is what you just squatted. She goes, oh. And I was like, yeah. So get out of your head. And a cue that I eventually gave to her, I was just like, get out of your head, squat the freaking weight. It's like, it's on the bar, just freaking do it.
And years and years ago, I worked with an athlete who had that same kind of like, if they thought about it too much, it was a problem. And I literally started bringing black garbage bags in, and I would make them leave when I loaded the weights, and then I would put garbage bags over them so they couldn't see how much it was. And I was like,
and
supposed to do 5.
we were strict because it's like if I saw that their technique was starting to go, I was like, we're done. Like, we're not doing, like, the lift wasn't set up for everyone to do a 1RM. It was set up that they would do a heavy triple. And if they wanted to do a single, I was like, we can do that, but just realize you have 3 other exercises you have to do today. So it's like, we're still going to make this a full lift.
Yeah, I think using technical failure as a metric for failure is a really great piece of advice for everybody who's in a sport, and lifting weights. Like, phenomenal piece of advice, because it's so easy to carry extra fatigue from your sport and everything. Like, if you're a power lifter, you might be able to get away with an ugly squat every once in a while, but like, it's real easy to get too far in the paint if you've got an ugly squat every week and you're doing your sport and, being a student and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Like,
I guess the only hard part would be, like, if you're alone, if you train, you don't have a coach, can you feel the technical failure? A lot of people, I would say, probably can't.
Yeah.
And then maybe not having a coach that can spot
what the technical failures are.
is.
Yeah.
Right? Like, so
Yeah.
I think that's why you see, like, it's just way easier to say, like, go until you fail.
Yeah.
It's just easier.
Yeah.
I guess. Like,
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I think that's why I think ingraining those habits at the high school level, I love working with those types of athletes. We were talking about this before because a lot of them aren't, broken yet. They haven't been taught bad technique yet. Now, granted, there's a lot of good coaches, but there's also a lot of bad coaches at the high school level. I remember when I was in high school, it was, you see that weightlifting, that program on the board, go do that. That person's doing a power clean, go do that. I was like, oh, like, I'm gonna make it look like that maybe, but being a researcher and everything who's looked at those movements, I was like, yeah, not that easy. It's not that easy just to say, okay, do a clean, do a snatch, I wish it was that easy, but there's a lot of different pieces of the puzzle to all those movements.
Yeah. Yeah, so if you're new to the sport or you've been in it for a while and you feel like you should be making more progress, maybe the takeaway is like it's okay to start with a goblet squat with elevated heel and move to a front squat and move to a high bar and move to a low bar or whatever, right? Like you just because you're a powerlifter doesn't mean you have to try to smash yourself into a low bar squat on day one and have it be ugly and go bomb out at meets and stuff. It is a developmental sport, right? Like it takes time to learn how to move and strength builds like a lot.
Yeah, and if you have intelligent programming, the problem is, having been in the powerlifting, having friends that were powerlifters, like I don't remember, like with my group with the Chris Wood,
Right.
I don't remember anybody ever saying like, "Oh, I'm on a down week," or like, "I'm going to take this is going to be a focus on technique." It was just
Right.
all throttle for 5 years,
Yeah.
So intelligently, like there is time.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe you're 6-8 months out until your next thing. Like, okay, now is where your technique is going to come in and get it fixed. But we just talk about men have egos and it's hard.
Yeah.
I guess it would be easier if you had a coach that could just tell you it's time. We're throttling it back.
I mean, to that point, I mean, I have had conversations with like the sport coaches for football, like the head coaches, and I've asked them, it's like, do your players, and this was a rhetorical question. They answered. I knew what the answer was going to be, but I said, do your athletes have to be powerful? And they said yes. And I said, when do they have to be powerful? And they said, all the time. And I was like, that's not possible. Like, it's not possible to be like, their definition of being powerful is being like peak performance all the time. And the reality is that's not possible. So we know that, but at the same time, how do you get that across to a sport coach that may not know like the intricacies of what you're actually talking about? Because I'm not trying to make a coach, like I'm not trying to talk down to a coach. I'm trying to meet them where they are in terms of the conversations that we're going to have. But at the same exact time, like that's where I really have to bite my tongue, because I'm like, I know what you're saying, but it's not always going to be that way. It's just not, but I think it's important to continue to have those conversations, because coach education is a massive piece to what we do.
Yeah, and I think even just like that piece of conversation right there's probably the conversation that you could have right away with a coach of being like, okay, I can do two things as a strength and conditioning coach, right? I can work towards physical changes in the athlete. We can put more muscle on them, less body fat, whatever, right? We can do those kinds of things. Or I can pilot them into a skill really well, right? So like we can ramp up their ability to produce the same amount of force at a certain velocity, or we can get them to move a little faster or something, right? But those two things are kind of like, they're kind of dovetailing interests, right? So like when we're spending time building capacity or changing tissue, right, it's not going to be our best time to build performance. And then when we build performance, it's not going to be our best time to change tissue. So if we, so like when we're planning a season or an out of season or a year or a 4-year, like which one of those buckets do we want to be spending most of our energy in? Because we're going to get more juice from the squeeze by focusing on one and then focusing on the other, kind of thing. Right.
And being in the world of football, so top football. I coached football at the school we're at for the last 10 years, and I've met a lot of coaches, and I just don't think that people, like Tim said, I don't think people think that way.
Mm-hmm.
It's just, well, you just train in the morning, and then after school go out and learn
Right.
the skill. So, and I think there's a little bit more of a popularity now with like bringing strength coaches at the high school level, like having really high quality strength coaches. So I have seen a little bit of a shift, but it's football.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the old guard. Everybody has what they did when they learned it, so it's hard to break.
Yeah, you're kind of always a generation behind.
Right,
It's always like I grew up playing baseball and played baseball through high school. I love the sport, but they are some of the individuals that I worked with the ETSU baseball team for 2 years as a strength and conditioning coach during my PhD while I was there. And I love the sport, but some of the traditions, it just makes me want to smack people in the back of the head. And it's like we had someone writing programs for our baseball team at my last institution, and the ratio of upper body to lower body exercises was like 4-1. And I was like, if they can't put force into the ground when they pitch, where does the stress go? And this, velocity is king when it comes to baseball, especially pitchers. It's like, how hard do you throw? But, being in Pittsburgh, like, Paul Skeens is here. Do you know why Paul Skeens throws as hard as he does? Because the dude's a tank. He's a tank. I mean, his lower half is so strong based on, just the look of the guy. But at the same exact time, you get some of the string bean people who are really tall, lanky, and they're able to throw hard, but all that stress is going to one spot. And that's why we see continuing with younger kids more Tommy John and everything, because we're not spending the necessary time developing the individual over the long term. They may have, been blessed to have the skills to be able to throw as hard as they do, but at the same exact time, the body is not meant to withstand that unless you're producing the necessary forces from certain areas of your body. So within that, this kind of gets back to this whole concept of this book and the long-term athlete development side of things. We have to be able to invest in strength if we want to be able to reap the benefits when we need them. So, I kind of mentioned this previously, but there's a whole chapter that's focused on program design. And a lot of that program design is talking about different training principles. So overload, specificity, variation, reversibility, and individualization. The reality is, a lot of individuals are focused on things like velocity-based training. I'm not going to say it's a buzzword, but it's become very popular.
I have a lot of questions about velocity-based training, so I'm really glad you brought it up, because I don't think we do it right.
Well, I would agree with you. So Brian Mann, really good friend of mine and everything, and has really brought velocity-based training to kind of the forefront of a lot of strength and conditioning programs. But he will be the first person to tell you that if you're not strong, you have no business using it. The idea is that it is something, and I've heard him say this, is that it's something you get to use, not something you have to use.
Yeah. So just for people who don't know, velocity-based training, there's a few ways that we can go about measuring it. And usually what we're doing, and this is the part where I have thoughts and I really want to hear your thoughts about, but usually what we're doing is we're measuring the bar speed. So kind of the gold standard probably is like the vertical position transducers, where you put a little cord that you put on your bar, and then as you move, it records what's happening to that cord throughout your range of motion, right? So what we're measuring is how fast you can move the bar just in like meters per second. And then you can take that information, because there's a pretty linear relationship between like your maximal force output and the velocity that you're moving it at, right? Like you can pretty much count that if you're at like, 50% of your maximum force, there's going to be some percent or some speed that you can maintain. But that's what we're talking about when we talk about velocity-based training. Is we're just tracking the speed of the bar to use that as feedback. And there's a lot of really great things about it, but there's also some issues.
There are some issues.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, with VBT, the three most touted aspects of it are that it certainly increases motivation from the sense that you can, create a competitive atmosphere in the weight room. If you have two people who can squat about the same weight, well, I moved it faster than you. Well, now I'm going to move it faster than you. And, that's great and all, but the downside of that is we start to forget about what technique actually is. Mm-hmm. And it's like, I'm going to do whatever I can to move this as fast as possible, and you're not going to stop me. But the second piece of it is this idea of being able to use load-velocity relationships every single, like when someone's warming up, to be able to predict a theoretical daily 1RM. Now, the issue with that is, depending on what loads the individuals use and how many loads they actually use will determine how accurate or not accurate the equation is actually going to be. I'm sure both of you have seen it. When you have an athlete warming up with, I'm making this up, like 50% of their max, they're having a conversation with the person next to them in the next rack. You know, they're not focused on moving that as fast as possible. You know, what are you going to do this weekend? Oh, you know, what was your English class like today? I heard that, I hate that teacher, you know, it is like those types of things. But, you know, the equations also with that tend to overestimate what the 1RM is going to be. We just ran an analysis, and it will be presenting hopefully at the NSCA National Conference, that with both a back squat and a hang power clean, it tended to overestimate the lifts by at least 10 kilos.
So
Trust
the
me.
line isn't really a linear line, it's more like logarithmic. It kind of tails off. Yeah.
Correct. And of course, it's based on the individual as well, because if I'm shorter and you're taller, you have more time to develop a velocity because you're increasing the displacement of the entire movement. I have a shorter time that I have to do it in, but you know, if we move create our max displacement over the same period of time, you create a higher velocity because you're taller.
Right.
That's the reality. Now,
I like
again,
the idea of taking that to kind of its logical extreme. Like you have a 2-foot squatter who only ever like the most explosive squatter ever, but only ever records like a 1/4 meter per second. And then
Right.
somebody who's 200 feet tall and is just slow as shit, but by the end they're like 20 meters per second.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The third concept is this idea of incorporating velocity loss thresholds. So it's like if I am in a power phase, maybe I want a 10% loss threshold, where if I'm prescribing, again, making this up, 4 repetitions, but by rep 2, they drop below the threshold, that's when we stop. So, you know, we stop the repetitions. You're not moving it fast enough. Therefore, we have to adjust the weight. And then during maybe maximal strength phases, we're focused on 20% drop off. But then in, you know, strength endurance or hypertrophy phases, we're focused on 30% drop off. The reality is, depending on how you load, you may not reach that threshold. But this idea has come about of what's been called flexible repetition schemes. So it's like if I prescribe 10 reps for somebody, but they're able to do 15 above the threshold that we have, we let them go. The problem with that is now I've introduced a different stimulus to an individual compared to what I wanted. It's the same thing that if I prescribe 5 reps and someone's able to do 10, I went from a general strength, you know, range to now I'm in a hypertrophy or, you know, like a strength endurance range for this individual. So it may be by design that I actually don't reach that threshold. So it's the same concept of like repetitions in reserve. It's like if I want someone to have 3 or 4 in the tank, that's by design. I'm not pushing them to failure. And then, you know, we progress over the coming weeks. But the flexible repetition scheme, I think, is going to vary the stimulus too much for the individual to actually hone in on what they want. And actually, if you go read a lot of the literature on that, I know Greg Hoff just gave a really good presentation at the ASCA International Conference in this past November, where he took different ideas of VBT and kind of went into the literature to see what they found. But the reality is load velocity profiles may not be reliable, number one. Number two, they may overestimate what the 1RM is. If that's the case, how do we know if it's actually accurate versus just doing a 1RM and seeing how accurate it is? and there are differences between a load velocity predicted and an actual 1RM depending on the exercise. In addition to that, the flexible repetition schemes, if you actually go into a lot of the literature that is compared, percentage-based 1RM or percentage of 1RM training versus VBT, you end up finding that there's either no difference or it favors the percentage-based. And part of that has to do with the fluctuation of, what is my theoretical 1RM that day.
Yeah, so the velocity thing, like the biggest positive for it might be the feedback for the lifter. Like, are you trying?
100%.
If you're trying to run a
benefit.
team, if you're trying to run a team, if you've got everybody on a velocity thing, they can self-regulate a little bit about whether or not they're really doing the work they're supposed to be doing.
Yes.
Just like Tim said, though, like I try to think about it, putting it straight into my own weight room. Like if let's say you had the money to put everything in there, like I just know the first thing, like you said, they're gonna get obsessed about going fast. So on the bottom of the squat, asses are coming, they're just shooting in the air. We're just doing good mornings. Deadlift would be insane. I'd imagine it would be with cleans where they're just hips are shooting back because they're trying to get out of the hole as fast as humanly possible. It's just like that's a nightmare. Like that's every second of my job is trying to get kids away from that.
Yeah. So maybe a good tool for more experienced lifters.
College level, like when I went and saw Ron and stuff at the UW, and then now he's at Alabama, like probably that level. Mm-hmm. Or maybe if I had a senior level class, I have the athletic level class, but still that's new athletes. Yeah.
I mean, I'll add a massive twist to this. And we just published a paper on this looking at the weightlifting movements, clean variations. We looked at the differences between barbell velocity and center of mass velocity, or what we would call system velocity. So we measured that from a force plate, and then we compared it to a velocity device or multiple velocity devices on the bar. And the take-home message is that they are different. Period. End of story. They do not show you the exact same thing. If we take a jump shrug where you do a hip hinge and then you jump as high as possible, and then you do a hang high pull where you do a hip hinge and you elevate the bar to chest height. If you look at the barbell velocity between the two, they're roughly about the same on average, about 3 meters a second, which is moving, no doubt about that. But I come back to this idea is where does the velocity come from? Because you have to go back to the equation. Meters per second. We talked about the differences in height. When you do a high pull, the bar, and you use one of the velocity devices, they start recording at the knee. As soon as you start coming up during that hip hinge movement, it goes from the knee all the way to the chest height for a high pull. The jump shrug, the bar goes down to the knee, but then you are transitioning and then jumping as high as possible. But the bar doesn't move much farther past your hip. So it's not a displacement thing. It's a force and speed thing. Because if I'm ballistic with an exercise, the movement is moving faster. A high pull is not fully ballistic. We'll call it a semi-ballistic exercise. But if you were to compare same exact load with those, if 20% that was at of a hang power clean max, if you look at the center of mass velocity, the peak velocity for a jump shrug at 20% was 2.5 meters per second, roughly. If you look at the hang high pull peak, it's less than 2. Mm-hmm. They're different. It's not the same exact thing. So it comes down to this idea, and this is a weird question to say, but what velocity is important?
Yeah.
Because if I'm a weightlifter, I need the barbell to move fast. Like that is in my deterministic model. If I don't move the barbell fast, I'm not making the lift. But if I'm a team sport athlete that is using weightlifting movements to develop an athlete, in my opinion, I should be focusing on center of mass velocity.
Yeah, so I was actually going to ask, and this might be getting too far into the weeds because I don't think this research exists yet, but is there anybody thinking about or doing, instead of meters per second, doing radians per second and thinking about the change in like the hip angle or the change at of shoulder extension and making that the thing that you measure instead of, the bar velocity?
We did one study back in, I think, 2014, where we were looking at the hip, knee, and ankle joint velocity during a hang power clean and a jump shrug.
Yeah.
And as you can imagine, with a jump shrug, because it is ballistic, you saw much higher, joint velocities compared to a hang power clean. But that being said, the only issue that you would run into with that, in my opinion, is that if you get someone who really overextends at the hip, then you're going to get a really high joint velocity and the technique's going to be poor. Compared to if you had someone who's really competent with it, they may not have as high a joint velocity, but they'll make the lift.
Yeah, yeah. So that radians per meter might be the metric that we want out of our athletes, but it might not be as conducive to technical proficiency uh, as something else.
Unless you know what you're looking at,
Right.
because like if I go and watch a weightlifting training session, like I'm not a weightlifting coach, I know the movements and I can pick out certain things. But if I'm having conversations with like Spencer Arnold or some of the other USA weightlifting coaches, they see things that I may not necessarily see, because they see those movements all the time. Now, granted, video is great for feedback and everything, so you can see it yourself. But at the same exact time, the ability to actually see that takes, development of that coaching eye. And I think with VBT, a lot of the coaching eye, I don't want to say it goes out the window, but we're too busy looking at tablets to tell us what the velocity says.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting.
Of the two people that watch this show, we just lost one of them. We've gotten so far, so we're gonna transition here. Get back. We're only on chapter 2. This is gonna be a 9-part series. Tim here.
We've gone through a few more. We've touched on
good.
more chapters.
So one thing we do every episode is Monroe's random ask question. I don't feel like I've talked for a while, so I'm gonna jump in here.
Nice.
And it kind of fits with what we've been talking about. We've been on the edges, but is there anything, it could be in training, doesn't have to be, but is there anything out there right now that really just is like bends your mind, something that you can't get your mind around, you're obsessed with thinking about, but it's like, oh. So I'll give an example. All right. So I'm not the most intelligent person, but I love thinking about space. But most of the concepts of space are so abstract that I just find myself going like, it's so insane. And then I'm sure this is old, but it's newer for me, of just the photos of the quantum entangled particles that came out, and they came out in their perfect yin yangs, like to the freaking like nth degree, a perfect yin yang, which like makes you think like, why was that a design? Like, what a random thing to see.
Right.
You know what I mean? And now like you're looking at like the basic of nature, it's there. Yeah. What the hell are those people seeing, and how did they know that shape? You know what I mean? Is it just completely random? Mm-hmm. But like, I don't know if you've seen the photo. We'll insert in editing right here. Okay, so I just popped it up there.
Thank you for giving me another job to do.
I won't forget about that. It's just crazy. I was just thinking about it earlier today. I was just like, God, what a weird thing. Were they doing ding lifting and quantum entanglements? Like, what is going on here?
It just happens when your blood pressure gets really high and you're about to pass out after a ding and you see it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know.
But does anybody else have anything that's just like, oh my, your brain can't even get around it? Radons or whatever the hell you were talking about?
Radians?
Hip radians?
I probably should have scaffolded that one a little bit, huh?
Yeah.
For the
well,
listener.
we talked about scaffolding. We did some
Yeah.
The only people that cared about that are the people we've had on the podcast. But
I mean, one of the things that I continue to come back to is there's research on this idea of force velocity profiles, and
Mm-hmm.
because we're generally focused as the end goal of developing power and rapid force production. I get it, But the reality is a lot of what has been, again, my opinion, but what has been done with that research has highlighted the importance of individualizing training, which is always important. But I would also make the argument that some of the recommendations that have been made are too black and white. So why this is a more complex concept is that just because a mathematical equation says do this, does that really make you better at everything? And those researchers have come out and said that a sprint force velocity profile and a jump force velocity profile are not related. They're unique to the task, which makes sense. We were talking about, strength being task specific, but my opinion and kind of how you are developing an athlete is, and I'm going to give a version of this presentation later this month and then at the national conference this summer at the NSCA, is training strength in a task-specific way. So, I'm going to go back and use your word of scaffolding because it is long-term development when it comes to different pieces. We have to understand the complexity of what develops a task. So like the NFL Combine going on, you see these people who are running crazy fast. Well, why are they running crazy fast? Is it technique? Is it fiber type? Is it God-given ability to produce force into the ground more effectively than somebody else? It's probably a combination of all of those things. We forever chase the genetic ceiling, but the concept all comes back to impulse. It's not like we're trying to make, sometimes I feel like we are reinventing metrics that already exist. We're making things more complicated than they need to be. So a quote that I got from Bob Alejo is, I love this, is tell me what it is and I'll tell you what we called it. Like the type of training that we talk about may be more researched now, but it's been around for a long period of time. So in my opinion, it's not necessarily a force velocity curve. It's probably an impulse spectrum is what it is. The other thing that I'd highlight about that force velocity curve research is there is no research to date, zero, that has looked at the concentric, isometric, and eccentric side of things. How can we prescribe off of one side of that curve when we don't measure the other side? It makes no sense to me. So, and again, it's not to knock the work that's been done because I feel like that work has certainly contributed to developing ideas and things like that. And, credit to those groups that have done that. But there's just more to do because it's so complex that, when we try to simplify things and say, this is the way to do it. Well, if that was the case, everybody would be training that way. Everybody would be training that way. So that's kind of something that I think about almost on a daily basis. I have a sticky note that's right next to me that has certain drawings on it that I feel like Sheldon Cooper when I'm just staring at a whiteboard, just expecting something to make sense after a while. But, hopefully I'll be able to at least, come to some conclusion around that concept in these upcoming presentations. And I feel like I touched on some of that theory within the book.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, with that, like in the scope of Josh's question, right? Like that is always I've said that, I think I've said this every episode. Every study is a request for more studies, right?
Oh,
and
yeah.
Right? And then when you get into like really, really, really thinking about what it is that your goals are and what you can accomplish with training and everything, like the web is plenty complicated. Like there's plenty to untangle to get to the point where you do have useful takeaways. Yeah. Yeah.
I did my dissertation on potentiation. If you want a web, that's a web.
Yeah.
There are so many things that have to go right for you to realize potentiation and get an improved performance. It's like the people have to be strong. They have to have the right fiber type. They have to have the right movement patterns. They have to stimulate the nervous system a certain way. And then the rest period has to be X amount. And it's so individualized that, a lot of potentiation projects end up finding nothing because you have this mixed group of people who aren't, homogeneic. So it's not going to give you, or homogeneous rather, that they're not going to give you the exact same results every time.
Yeah, so another scaffolding for the listener. Potentiation is when we have a series of interventions in order to elicit a change in performance. So the goal is are they warmed up? Are they doing a specific activity? So that we can measure more power, or more jump, or more whatever. Am I describing that correctly? Or
Yeah,
how wrong
so
am I?
yeah, no, I mean the simple way I kind of describe it is if you have two exercises that are similar in terms of their movement pattern.
Mm-hmm.
If I have a back squat and I have a jump, so I'm going to do a heavy back squat and then I'm going to do an unweighted jump. That would be a potentiation complex with the goal of enhancing the performance of the jump, not necessarily the squat.
Yeah, so this would be in the context of sport, outside of training, right? In the context of sport, it would be doing a warm up that makes sense for your sport, right? You're going to try, if you're in a power sport, you're going to try to do some things that recruit a lot of muscle fibers, generate some body heat, all that kind of stuff, right? If you're in an endurance sport, you're going to try to do some stuff that gets your blood flowing and, get your heart rate up a little and get your O2 up, moving and stuff, right?
Absolutely.
I got one thing on there, Kyle. You still have to answer yours, so don't forget. But when we had Max 8 on, he had talked about weightlifting AI, and Tim, you had said you're starting to theorize that everything, and I think we understand this, that an individual plan would probably be better. But our classes, my classes, I have a co-teacher, and they're usually somewhere between 50 to 70 people, and not very long. So we have a limit. But I'm thinking of if you have the coach that's worrying about I don't remember if we had clicked record yet, but we had talked about the coach is there to learn the athlete, to make sure that they're having a good day, to make sure that they're loving training, and then having something like a weightlifting AI that's actually doing all the recording and watching of the athletes. So it's almost doing the individual plan within its, maybe you build the spectrum of the plan, but now all of a sudden it's programming 90 people differently. The coach is just being a coach. Do you see something like that? When the first time Max talked about weightlifting AI, I was like, oh man, they're going to steal our jobs. The robots are coming from my spot.
And then you were like, no, it might make it better.
Yeah, then I just thought about that. Oh man, that would be really awesome to be. Now, obviously, it's a ways off and you have money and stuff, but I was like, oh, that would be really nice that kids could take off in their own individualized silos within the program.
I mean, embrace AI because it's here and it's not going to go away. But what I will say is that AI will, unless we develop the necessary robots that are actually going to be in there and coach and exercise, it's not going to replace coaching.
Right.
Now, just as an experiment,
I've had some coaches that should take place.
Yeah. But just as an experiment, I typed into ChatGPT, I said, design a weightlifting program that will improve my clean and jerk, or clean and jerk and snatch 1RM. And it generated a program that has, as you can imagine, variations of those exercises. It has squat variations and things like that. But the first thing that you see is a lot of the exercise would be very close to failure, like training near failure. Granted, if you want to lift heavy, you're going to have to lift heavy eventually. That's just the nature of the beast. But at the same exact time, the one thing that it doesn't say anything about is what the technique looks like.
Right.
It gives you a number. It's I use this example all the time, is if I prescribe 80% for an athlete, 80% 1RM for an athlete, and they walk in, they look like they've been through the ringer and everything, and I'll have a conversation with them. They're just like, yeah, I just broke up with my boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever. Well, I know personally that is going to be one of two things. They're either going to have a really bad lift or they're going to have a really good lift. You know, hopefully the latter. But at the same exact time, AI is not going to tell you to modify the training program based on that.
Right.
The human interaction and the conversation with the individual, like I'm not going to say that AI can't get there because the capabilities are kind of endless, but at the same exact time, if I come up to you and I say, we just had, a death in the family or whatever, I know I'm supposed to lift these weights. I'll warm up like I'm going to, but we'll see where we go. Like you can't, AI will be like, here's your program.
Mm-hmm.
Now, granted, when I did type that into ChatGPT, it gets to the end of it after you look through it and it says, let me know if you want me to make adjustments based on whatever. It's like you could type in your 1RMs and then it can give you specific loads. But again, it comes back to what we just talked about. You may give me specific loads, but you're not compensating for how I feel that day.
Yeah, I did the same experiment. I will still compete in track meets sometimes just for funsies, gets me outside and stuff. And I asked it to write a program for a hammer thrower. And so it kicked me out of the program, but it did not ask me, if I've been training for 20 years or how much I weigh or how, how many ligaments I'm missing. None of those questions were in there. And so when it gives you a program, it's a pretty generic template. Like it's not a great, not a great tool yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. This was not a recommendation to go on ChatGPT and just start pumping out. Well, those probably people on Instagram.
You've met some coaches.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so we've already been going for a while. Let's talk about the rest of your book real quick. So we got up to advanced strength stuff.
How many chapters are in the book?
How many chapters?
We might not be able to get.
Should we do a part two?
We might have to have you back when the book drops.
There are 12 chapters in the book, and
maybe
so
we should do a part two.
With all the things that we have mentioned, we're through half of it.
Yeah.
So defining strength related adaptations is chapter 2. Underlying mechanisms or underpinning mechanisms is chapter 3. But then we get into like principles and organization of training, and then the training methods that we talked about are chapters 5 and 6. So the principles organization is like that's the periodization and the planning side of things, the different training principles. But beyond the program design stuff, that's where we start to get into mixed methods or concurrent training. So within the concurrent training, we'll talk about long, slow distance, sprint training, HIIT training, maximal aerobic speed, all of these being incorporated together in kind of the different effects that they can be on strength. So we talk about the interference effect and how that may impact, rapid force production versus peak force production. The following chapter gets into measuring strength, and admittedly it's probably one of the denser chapters because strength is on a continuum. Mm-hmm. So you have your 1RM strength from your big lifts like your squat, bench, pull, or your deadlift rather, but then you have like your explosive strength that you have like a 1RM power clean or snatch or something like that. But then you have things like loaded jumps that are faster than your Olympic list, but they may actually show unique strength characteristics. Reactive strength, so you have rebound jumps and drop jumps to show those types of characteristics. So we talk about that, but then the following chapter gets into how do we monitor strength changes, but also different ways that we can load. So this goes back into the concept of linear loading versus percent 1RM versus set rep best, APRE, VBT, which we talked about, RM zones. So all different methods of the way people have programmed, but also how to adjust for that. And then the final 2 chapters are on nutritional considerations for strength as well as recovery considerations for strength. So I'm biased, obviously, because I wrote it, but at the same exact time, it is being able to write a textbook on one concept, a broad concept nonetheless, but a concept, certainly helps narrow the focus. But the fact that there's a separate book on hypertrophy, the fact that there's a separate book on strength, and I know that there's other books on power development, certainly contributes to the idea of how complex strength and conditioning is, and how important it is to understand the science behind developing necessary or effective training programs for those concepts.
Yeah.
So, Kyle, Tim, you guys could tell me to go to hell and we just plow on. But I feel like that almost, like we talked, almost like the base. That's like the next level, like going into those chapters. Tim, did you say it was dropping like May? June?
June, July.
Like maybe
so probably early July.
Like, would this be like a continuation of the conversation? Maybe.
Yeah. Would you be willing to come
you back on when the book's about to release? Maybe we can, look, it's the book.
Yeah.
It has a title.
I'd love to be back on.
And then we can dive back in there because I know Kyle, and none of those chapters are going to be small. Like,
I'm salivating. Yeah, I'm like, I don't want to have him back one time. I want to have him back 10 times.
There's a reason we started a podcast.
You just became the third co-host of the show.
We could never get through a business meeting without going down these rabbit holes. So maybe that's the best way to do it, is we just program another one in.
Yeah.
And we talk to you this summer, right before it drops.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean,
happy to.
Yeah. Okay. Cool. All right. Well, in that case, thanks everybody for listening. Thanks, Tim, for being here.